First tonight, the frustrating, escalating exasperation of a weak and infirm Nigerian economy, full of enormous potential but undermined by seismic mismanagement, as well as other debilitating elements such as chronic electricity shortages, a massive debt problem, failure to properly unify the exchange rate, and a seeming inability to set the right macroeconomic targets for the country. All this as the World Trade Organization cuts its global trade forecast for this year by over 50%, down from 1.7% to 0.8%. Now, as we mentioned at the outset, it's inevitable that is going to affect living standards for everyone around the world, including here in Nigeria, where the removal of fuel subsidies has left an already troubled economy in desperately bad shape. So, in that context, what are the best macroeconomic targets to set for Nigeria? Well, for more on this, I'm joined now on the line from Lagos by Nigeria's former Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, Dr. Kalu Idika Kalu. Dr. Kalu, thank you so much for coming in. I know you had a bit of a challenge just before you made it on air, but the gentleman that you are, here you are. Thank you very much indeed. Let me start by asking you, why has this expected post-COVID bounce back of the global economy encountered a bit of a blip, and how might that affect the economy here in Nigeria, which is already in dire straits? In other words, why is there so much uncertainty around the trade outlook?
Thank you very much, Charles. It's my pleasure to be here. Well, we know macroeconomics is a whole bag of pluses and minuses, you know. Yes, we're talking about post-COVID, but there are also lingering ideas about post-COVID diseases, particularly in some of the advanced countries. And of course, when they say that, that means it's not going to be opening up, which means the markets are not opening up as much as one would have thought with the reduction of the regular COVID that we know about. But more importantly, I think those who manage the various countries, each country has to strategize, even though there might be a global reduction, as the WTO is projecting 50%. For countries like Nigeria, we are always known to be so full of potential. There's so much undercapacity utilization. There's so much let down in certain sectors because of some of the macroeconomic issues that we've had. So I think the first thing to be said that we shouldn't be so pessimistic. We can't draw a lowering of our heights just from the general slowdown that the WTO is projecting. Whether you are looking at the agricultural sector, you are looking at the manufacturing sector, and certainly we all know about the oil sector. We've been way under even the OPEC quota, when we should be striving to even top it and give very good reasons why we can top it. We can't even do that. We are producing well under. So when a country like Nigeria has all these potentials, just about in every sector. I'm not even going to the services sector. Of course, we have to also understand the constraints of infrastructural facilities which affect all the real sectors, as we call them. But we don't necessarily have to expect us to be down by 50%. In fact, some countries, by just playing the macroeconomic situation properly, might actually make some gain, while others may make some losses. We are not going to be debating who are going to be making gains and losses, but if you had to take a bet, you will have thought that given our situation, given our heavy unemployment, given how long we've stayed way below our capacity, it's easy to see why there are all these dislocations, but we can also make the most of it by making sure that, as you pointed out earlier, The oil sector, for instance, there is no reason why our refineries should not have been producing. We just missed the right policy at the time it should have come. We should have exploited the empty, relatively cheap empty refining in Europe while we are building up green fields that were recommended, about 3 of them if I recall. For manufacturing, yes, we've created so much, a little bit of harsh conditions that rather than stabilize and move forward, we know that a few actually pulled away. So by taking some fiscal measures, we can also attract some of these things back and give incentives, as we are now hearing, little incentives to be offered to manufacturing to make some forward move in terms of re-engaging and improving their capacity and, of course, meeting domestic needs.
Right. Well, I'm gonna
substitution.
Right.
From the rising.
I'm sorry to interrupt you there. I mean, obviously, you've set it out very well,
Okay.
and I mean, it's always such a great benefit having someone like yourself with the kind of experience you have here. I want to come back to the domestic situation in just a minute, but let's just establish what is happening internationally and then come to how that might affect what is going on in Nigeria. Because beyond things like tight monetary policy that we see many countries imposing, and perhaps the fact that China hasn't recovered quite as quickly as had been hoped from COVID restrictions that they imposed in 2022, are we seeing the continuing effects of the war in Ukraine?
Definitely. You know, you can't really abstract totally from the domestic scene, because we should be riding on the Indian and the Chinese. I've always said that, rather than where we are expecting to be importing from them. We should be riding on their large economies who form such an insignificant part of their imports. But beyond that, yes, all the monetary indicators will show some sort of constraining effect on the importation by some of these major countries. And of course, this is very likely to affect Nigeria. But we should not paint that too broadly. What do we really export to some of these countries beyond oil? Yes, there are other products in the manufacturing sector. There are products in the IT sector that, in fact, gives some sort of a leeway to break into some of these markets. But there is no question that any cutback by these major economies, rather than where they're expanding to locate their production chain in our own economy, we should be encouraging. All that will be bound to affect the growth of the Nigerian economy, of the rebounding of those sectors that should have created more demand for our production and also created the domestic jobs and capacity which we should expect. So, yes, there's a direct relationship, but I think when you try to paint the brush too broadly, you forget that really we have not been as big a player as you would have thought to have that direct effect. But from their own side, of course, when they have all these tight ministry policies, these are bound to affect our own performance.
They're very good points you raise, and obviously that underscores the situation in Nigeria as far as sort of the economic outlook is concerned. But let's now get more into the Nigerian scene, and at the risk of making you repeat yourself, even though we don't mind because we like listening to what you're saying, I wonder, what are the biggest causes for concern for you as far as the Nigerian economy goes? I know you've talked about the fact that subsidy, for example, should have been phased out rather than removed.
Yes, well, I might as well start with that. I think, yes, it was a bold move, but it's clear to us now, I said this a few months ago, that yes, we should have taken a strong stand by acknowledging the sheer inefficiency, by acknowledging the imports of the corruption within that subsector of subsidy, which arises from the differential between imported prices and domestic administered prices. We should have maybe had a much better feeling about our position now if we more or less did the calculations of the kind of burden that will now be falling on the consumer and spread it out a little bit. Essentially, you can interpret that as sustaining the subsidy but on a reducing level, or a sort of a lower scale level over, I don't know, 18 months, 2-year budget period, or even a little bit more. So that generally would be the way to have handled that, particularly after we've allowed it to fester for so long. We had the same experience, 2012, where the same issues were raised. And it was thought that, having written some of these papers myself, that I would have been clapping for the way the previous two administrations tried to do it. But I said, no. There is no disagreement about the need to reduce this distortion. Even as we say so, I think it should be clear that this is not end of subsidies. As we know, most countries have subsidies, but it has to be planned subsidy that actually does not distort the macroeconomy, that contributes to efficiency because they encourage growth, and it's really a good way of administering your resources. But it's a more active way to administer subsidies rather than where you are like hostage because of the differential that arises when your domestic prices are kept at a certain level and importers are facing external prices that they cannot do much about. Somebody has to pay the difference. So that is one thing. Leaving the subsidy issue, I think clearly the issue of security in a general sense, where we can see that the government is rising to that occasion. We've had statements from the military directly that they're going to deal with security. Well, it's easier said than done, but the citizen really needs to feel that a lot is being done to create a situation where people are going back to the farms, are going back to the markets, are traveling across to sell their goods as cheaply as they devise, and they are able to produce and keep their staff in place. So security is another issue. The issue of debt, again, plays a role.
Right, let me just, I apologize for interrupting you, because, I mean, these points, I want to go through them sequentially. I want to sort of isolate each one so that you give it the necessary sort of analysis. Now, one of the things that a lot of people have talked about is the exchange rate. What about unifying the exchange rate so that you don't have so many windows? Because I know you raised that point yourself some time ago.
Yes, I was a little miffed that we've been talking about this for, if you like, 5 decades almost, since the 80s. And I had a very knowledgeable journalist, I should say that when you start talking about unifying the exchange rate, that was like one of the IMF conditionalities. And I said, oh my God, But clearly, just like we are removing subsidies, some of these subsidies have been administered principally through these disparate exchange rates. Yes, you may want to encourage certain lines of production, but you have to be very clear by what means you give this incentive. Certainly, when you distort the exchange rate by the kinds of dimensions that we saw, absolutely unheard of differentials between so-called official window and other so-called productive windows and so on and so forth, you create other distortions. So there's no question that unifying the exchange rate is one of the instruments that you have to use to begin to restore efficiency and also restore a sense of a level playing field for all investors and producers and so on and so forth. But again, having left it for so long and having aggravated that distortion over so many sectors over time, you also have to know how to do that so it does not create a heavy hiatus that will impact severely on the price system. Secondly, that's where the debt resource mobilization comes in. Just as you are
ask you about
doing this
that.
through the market.
Sorry to interrupt you again, but let me ask you about that debt issue and about debt financing. I want to ask you directly, Should Nigeria be borrowing given that it is in such debt, or should it perhaps borrow to get out of debt?
Well, you just said it. We should borrow, given our level of income, given our potential, like we've said over the years. In other words, the possibilities of creating wealth. So what is important is not really the issue of borrowing. It's the kind of analysis that you have to bring to bear, not only in terms of the overall program and the balance of payment support that you need to support the import content of that program, but at the project level, what you need to implement a project profitably already involves setting out the interest costs, setting out the grace period, and the amortization period. Once those are right, you can continue to borrow until they get to the point where the cost of borrowing now begins to come close to the overall rate of return on the borrowing. So given the level of unemployment, given the work that we need to do in the oil sector, in the agricultural sector, in the manufacturing sector, name it, just about every sector. In fact, we need to be funding our IT sectors, including our film industry. They are always perpetually short of the kind of funds they need to just assist them to get a few capital issues sorted out. So we should really not, at the level of Nigeria, we should not be talking globally about borrowing. We should be talking about why we are borrowing. Certainly, having said that, it is very distressing to talk about borrowing to pay salaries. It's distressing to talk about borrowing for non-exhaustive expenditures, which will come out of government revenues. So, but for capital expenditure, surely that is why there are banks locally. That's their business, to look at projects at the individual level, at the local government, at the state level, and so on. So yes, we should not be talking about borrowing in the abstract.
Right. Okay. Well, that's a very good point and very good advice. Well, let's look. You talked about the domestic banks and so on. Let's look internationally at the IMF, for example. We've just seen Ghana going to the IMF for money. Should Nigeria, to use your language, swallow its pride and take an IMF loan, or is it not about pride and should be more about strategy?
Well, clearly, I would never have said we should swallow our pride. We are the one in the deep waters. And if you look at, we've talked about the Asian tigers, or those that they are neighbors, those who have grown at 8, 10, 15% in real terms for a length of time. It is supposed to be part of your strategy. I think most people don't really understand the fact that when we talk about IMF conditionalities, the IMF is as somebody said, as I was sitting out there watching, is the first line of contact for developing countries, because their funds are relatively low in terms of interest costs, even though they are not long-term, but they are medium-term. And as members, you try to get as much of that as possible. But never mind that in Nigeria, we always looked at it in negative terms to start talking about swallowing our pride. There's no pride to swallow. It should be part of the strategy, actively seeking to get a soft term in your first tranche before you start getting forward to the ADBs and the World Bank, and then the bilaterals and so on and so forth, before you now consider commercial loans. But of course, commercial loans may be less likely to be asking you for the kind of stringent policies that will make sure that the funds are utilized properly. So when the IMF asks that, it's not for their own use. It is for the use of their member countries, and also to encourage other multilateral and bilateral to join in helping the country recover. So that is really the strategy. It's a strategic, positive strategic decision to go and borrow from the fund, to make the most of what you can get back for the money you pay to the fund as members, and you subscribe to funding other countries. So why not? So it's about time that we put that kind of fear out of our citizens talk about it meant swallowing our pride. There's no pride to be swallowed. In fact, it should be deliberate strategic planning.
Very interesting. Yes, you've made a lot of you make a lot of sense there. I just hope the right people are listening. But overall, Dr. Kalu Idika Kalu, what would you say is the best macroeconomic targets to set for Nigeria today, given the way things are? And we've got about a couple of minutes left for this conversation.
Well, theoretically, you can always throw out a number, but hopefully that number is the weighted average of the kind of growth, the kind of targets you should set for your rural development, for your manufacturing, for your mining, for your infrastructure. So we can toss out a number, 5%, 6% real growth, but by the time you break it down, you should be able to explain how you aggregate the sectoral growth to that overall growth of the economy. I know it sounds very nice to have a rounded figure and so on, but an economy like Nigeria, with the kind of unused capacity we have, with the kind of unutilized labor, not to mention material resources, we should be setting much higher target. But as an economist, I don't think it's fair for me to just toss a number alike. In Korea, when I worked on Korea, they were growing at 12, 15, 16% in real terms. And I know that at the various board meetings, people were always astounded how they were growing so fast. In some years past, Nigeria's manufacturing was growing at 16%, 17%. We can get back to those growth rates, but we have to address the issue of roads, transportation, power, of course, security I've already mentioned, and then mobilizing the right mixture of domestic funds with the international funding. So you have all these things in place. Nigeria should be growing a lot faster. This was even envisaged in those days, that Nigeria was going to emerge, if you like, as the new Korea or new Taiwan. The potential is still very much there.
Yes, well, that's very, very informative. We've just got about a minute and a half or so left, and thank you very much indeed for your very illuminating analysis. But obviously, the political environment in Nigeria affects the economy because it is the politicians who make a decision about which direction the economy should go. So away from macroeconomic policy and the global economy, what is making the news for you right now in Nigeria?
Well, for me personally, from yesterday, the positive news, I saw a meeting of the Southeast governors. You know, for many years back, many of us worried. We talked about this, that the Southeast, just like the Northeast and the Northwest and the rest of the zones of this country, the governors should be working together. They should be pressurizing the federal government for policy changes that they need that will make their situation more comfortable. So that is one positive news. The other positive news, of course, is like we seem to be getting to the end of the judicial process, looking at all the problems we had with the last election. So long as we now begin to pull that together and the sense of all the politicians coming together, I know there are standing issues. We know in the last few days, some of those tended to be exacerbated. But my impression is that we are moving towards some kind of closure. And then, of course, as I said earlier, if the security situation improves, we have enough domestic impulse to move us forward politically and economically, provided we stay on that course. And the real sign there is a deceleration of the fears, getting all this issue of banditry and so on, that are really affecting the ordinary saver and consumption and trader and businessman. Those do a lot of harm. Once we get those under control, and we require a lot of political will to sustain them. So there's a lot to hope for, and I hope that our politicians will focus on that to create that free environment for maximum resurgence of the Nigerian economy.
And that's very wise counsel indeed. And on that note, I want to say thank you very much indeed. I deeply appreciate the time you've taken to talk to us this evening. That's Nigeria's former Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, Dr. Kalu Idika Kalu, and he was talking to me on the line from our studios in Lagos.